Some of the states have already legalized and it's
providing a fresh perspective on the events shaping the cannabis industry. With your host, Deputy Chief of Roc NORML,
Steve Vanderwall.
From business and politics to medicine and technology, and everything in between. This is Roc NORML Radio.
What is up, everybody? Happy 1st of July. I can't believe that June is over, and it's even harder to believe in 8 months we'll be ankle deep in snow. But let's not talk about that, because today we are going to talk about a slippery little hemp bill that made it through the legislature at the 11th hour after the death of the MRTA. Because in the final day of the 2019 legislative session, the State Senate and Assembly passed bills sponsored by Senator Jen Metzger and Assembly Member Donna Lupardo to regulate the production and marketing of hemp extract in the state, including cannabidiol, also known as CBD. This legislation establishes a regulatory framework for hemp extract production, extraction, manufacturing, and sale in New York, updating the hemp permitting process and regulating the extract industry through testing and labeling, protecting both farmers and consumers. It also requires that New York State hemp processors use New York-grown product. Here to discuss this new hemp bill is a returning guest and political director of Roc NORML, Jason Klimek. Hello.
Hello, Steve. Thanks for having me back.
Thanks for coming on the show. I know you're on vacation this week. It's very nice of you.
Yeah, well, I'm always down to talk cannabis,
Obviously. So before we dive into the intricacies of this hemp bill, I want to talk about the current state of the bill, right? Because the governor has not signed the bill. We know that it has been passed through the Senate and through the Assembly, but on the New York State Senate website, it says that there are no bills awaiting the governor's signature. What do we make of that?
So we did a little research this morning, because I'm going to tell you a little secret about being a lawyer and law school is we don't actually focus too much on state-specific stuff. Every law student will tell you everything you can want to know about federal law, but state law, we're all a little clueless. So we looked up today what all that means. And so if the bill was given to the governor while the legislature was in session, the governor has 10 days to sign the bill, and if he doesn't, it becomes law. If the bill is given to the governor out of session, the governor has 30 days to sign the bill, or if he doesn't, it is what's known as a pocket veto, or it has the effect of a veto and it kills the bill. So our best reading right now is that we're out of session because we know we are out of session, but the bill has not been handed to the governor. We know it passed the legislature during the session, but it doesn't look like it was handed to the governor during the session. So it looks like when it hits his desk, we will be in that 30-day window, assuming that it hits sometime between now and December 31st. What the governor is going to do, we don't know. His office has been dead silent. I have not heard a single word from him or any of his staffers on hemp. I mean, this bill kind of crept up out of nowhere. We really didn't know about it until the last week or so before the end of session.
Yeah, I mean, it was like balls to the wall MRTA up until the 11th hour, and it got squashed. And after that, we weren't even really sure what happened. All of a sudden, we hear rumors that a decrim bill and then a hemp bill and possibly a medical expansion bill were making its way through the legislature. But lo and behold, the decrim and hemp bill passed. But the hemp bill was something that we were really relatively unfamiliar with up until about a week ago. So I'm excited to kind of dive into it, because there are some interesting things incorporated into this bill, and I'm excited for you to kind of dissect them. And the first that we're going to dive into is the hemp extract regulation. And I'm going to quote some language from this bill so you can kind of have a primary resource and understand really what's going on. The industrial hemp used for research pursuant to this section shall be sourced from authorized New York State industrial hemp producers. The research partner may obtain an exemption for only grain or fiber from this requirement upon a satisfactory showing to the department that a suitable variety of industrial hemp for the research project is not grown in New York and or the use of New York sourced hemp is not practicable for the project. And this is what's really important. Hemp for extracts can only be sourced from authorized New York State industrial hemp producers. Now tell me, what's the problem with that?
Well, so I think that there's a little bit of a constitutional issue there. And, I think by the end of this podcast, you might be rethinking your whole excitement about what we're going to get into today, because we're going to get into some con law. And while I find that exciting, it has a tendency of glazing people's eyes over. So just be warned.
But it's important.
Oh, it's very important. These are things that control the country, really. I mean, this is how our laws have evolved for the last 100 or so years with the Commerce Clause. So, I mean, it is very important, but I would just warn any listeners, probably don't do this right before bed, or else you're going to miss some pretty good stuff. So let's get into it. So why is this potentially unconstitutional? Well, we have to go all the way back to, I think it was like the 1930s. There was a Supreme Court case called Wickard v. Filburn. And Wickard v. Filburn was essentially, there was a federal law that said that farmers could only grow so much wheat so as to not affect the prices of wheat across the nation and bottom them out. This farmer was growing wheat in excess of the prescribed amounts. But here's the important part, is he was growing wheat totally within his state. He wasn't even selling it. He was literally just using it for his own consumption. Now, there's a clause in the Constitution that says that the federal government may regulate the commerce between the states, the Commerce Clause, as it's typically known. So the feds found out about this and tried to put a stop to it. And his argument, the farmer's argument, was, well, this isn't interstate commerce. This is never crossing a state border. This is intra-state commerce. It's within the state. So you, federal government, have no right to regulate me. The Supreme Court did not agree with that. The Supreme Court's rationale was basically, if we look at every single wheat farmer, and if they were doing the same things that you're doing, only growing within their state, for themselves, you would still affect the entire price of wheat, because you would be not going out and buying wheat from other people. You would be growing it yourself, and thus wheat prices would go down. So the federal government on that rationale, or the Supreme Court on that rationale, said, no, under the Commerce Clause, the federal government can regulate interstate or wholly intrastate commerce under the idea of this aggregation theory. In 2005, and this will come up momentarily, in 2005, kind of right out of that line, about 75 years later, there's a Supreme Court case where the federal government was attempting to regulate medical marijuana within California. The argument there was the federal government has no right to regulate that wholly intrastate commerce because, again, it was federally legal. They were not selling over the border or anything like that. And moreover, not only was it wholly intrastate, but it was federally illegal. So the feds didn't even have an ability to regulate that commerce because it technically at the federal level couldn't exist. Again, the Supreme Court disagreed. They said not only can we do that, it doesn't matter that it's illegal. We can regulate that under the aggregation theory because you are affecting prices and you are affecting interstate commerce. So now with all that constitutional law history, let's look at what this bill says. This bill says that you have to use New York source hemp. Well, as it turns out, that might be a violation of the Commerce Clause because you can't favor in-state companies. Now, not only might that be a violation of the Commerce Clause, but now you're also dealing with potentially the Equal Protection Clause and Privileges and Immunities Clause. This is, we're getting into a lot of issues here. And one of the rationales I've heard for why this may be not unconstitutional is because the FDA has come out and said, well, they haven't actually made any regulations, but they put out right after the Farm Bill passed at the end of 2018, they put out a statement saying, well, in our opinion, CBD specifically is still illegal unless you comply with all of the FDA approval processes because it's an active ingredient in a pharmaceutical. So the rationale would be, well, this is illegal at the federal level, So it's wholly within the state, and therefore we can discriminate against out-of-state producers and manufacturers because there's no interstate commerce implication. But what did we just discuss? There is, in fact, an interstate commerce implication because the Supreme Court has addressed it multiple times over the last 100 years. So while there's an argument, I think the Supreme Court is pretty clear-cut on which way this falls. And so I, as a former federal district court clerk who drafted decisions, I don't know how this can survive a challenge. In fact, the minute this bill is signed into law, I wouldn't be shocked if every out-of-state producer, or at least one out-of-state producer, is bringing this into federal court. It's a federally legal good, hemp, that seems to be in violation of the Commerce Clause. So I'm just very unclear.
My question is, you look at the MRTA, which has been in circulation for the last 5 years. There's been a lot of eyes on it. There's been a lot of expert input from both the industry side and the political side and the medical side. This bill gets shut down. All of a sudden, we have this hemp bill appear in the 11th hour. How does a bill not only appear like that in the 11th hour, but have what seems to be a direct violation of the Constitution written in the first 4 pages? How does that even happen? How does that make it through 2 houses to the governor's desk? I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around that.
Well, I think it's important to remember that legislators don't have to be lawyers. There's no requirement. The people drafting the law, because realistically, legislators themselves, the elected individuals, are not sitting there drafting the bill. It's their staff. They don't have to be lawyers. So other than the Senate and Assembly's central staff who may look at this and who there may be some lawyers looking at it, there doesn't necessarily have to be a lawyer involved in every single step of this, or they could be looking to just hope that it gets through and that the New York courts will side on their side. I don't think the federal courts will. And an out-of-state processor or an out-of-state producer is going to have standing to bring this in a federal court. So I honestly don't know. It's very concerning when bills contain things like this, especially when they pop up out of nowhere. This is how you get bad law, frankly. As much as it's great to support the New York economy, you have to do it right. And we can actually look, sometimes we say that cannabis shouldn't be compared to alcohol and things like that, but in this case, we actually can. So I forget what year it was, 2012, I think. New York redid parts of the alcohol law, and they did what's called a farm brewery license. And a farm brewery license says if you use, I don't think it's 100%, but I think it's a high percentage, 80, 90%, something like that, New York sourced hops and other ingredients, then you can have this farm brewery license, which allows you to brew, distribute, and sell at retail. Typically, you can, just like the MRTA prohibitions on vertical integration, the previous alcohol law had those same limitations. But the farm brewery license provides an alternative path that if you want to do everything from A to Z and you use New York source material, you can do it all. But that's the important part, is it provides an alternative path, because people can still decide to not use New York source stuff. They just are then prohibited from doing the manufacturing, distribution, and retail. They can only select, a portion of that. So that's the important part, is that it doesn't discriminate against interstate commerce. It just says, hey, if you want to do all of this stuff, then you can use this license. But if you don't, you can use this other license, and that's totally fine. The hemp bill doesn't have that kind of alternative. It's either use New York source hemp to make your hemp extract or don't. And that's it.
Well, the mandate is where the issue comes in. I think that language would have been really strong if the THC market became legalized, because it is not a federally legal substance, right? So you would have had to source from your state. But I think if you included language that offered some sort of an incentive, like, hey, if you source, seed to sale all your hemp products for extracts, maybe there's a tax incentive. Maybe you can have a small vertically integrated operation. But to mandate it, you can't do that.
No, that's exactly correct. And there's potentially arguments. I haven't done the full blown like analysis on this stuff, but there's potentially arguments that you could make that you can kind of stack the deck sort of kind of against out-of-state companies, because there's some case law that that indicates that, well, maybe you can have higher licensing fees for out-of-state companies. And the rationale there is they're not engaged in commerce yet, because if they're not licensed to do the thing in New York, then you can charge them a higher licensing fee because they're not in interstate commerce, and therefore you can't violate interstate commerce clause. There's a Supreme Court case that kind of touches on that. But you can't just say, well, you can only use stuff from New York. Well, what about the other 49 states? They're going to have a problem with that too.
Well, for me, as a business owner who manages a seed to sale supply chain, my first thought when I looked at this was like, oh shit, how's that going to affect my business? Because I do a lot of work in Vermont, my extracting and some of my hemp that I source is from Vermont. But after we have that conversation, regarding, hey, well, it's not that constitutional. I'm not too worried. Should other CBD or hemp based businesses be worried about this?
I mean, I think, part of it is going to be, well, they should just be kind of aware that this is a thing that's happening, because, as I'm sure we'll get into a little later, the hemp bill is very, very expansive. I mean, it really regulates the market, which is a good thing. Sure. I mean, I'm not saying we should have this totally Wild West unregulated market. That's not what I'm saying. It's that we just have to do it right. So I think that they do need to be aware of this. The fact that the governor's office has been completely silent, it doesn't even appear to be on the governor's desk, I would say that leans in favor of this maybe isn't a thing to worry about right now, but who knows? I mean, he could come out tomorrow and say, you know what, I'm going to sign this thing. We just don't know. They've been completely tight-lipped. So it provides an interesting conversation topic. And like, if you look at it, in another, just think about it like for anything that's not controversial. Think about like, I don't know, cereal. Could you ever have a bill that says, well, if you want to sell cereal in New York, it's got to be New York source cereal? Of course not. Like, people would look at that and be like, that's objectively crazy. So why would that be any different than hemp? I mean, I get that we're trying to like foster this young industry and things like that, but you can't just throw the Constitution out the window because you want to favor your own producers. That's not how things work. So, I mean, I don't think things are going to radically shift overnight. We'll definitely know when things are going to happen. I mean, the bill itself, once it's signed by the governor, still takes 90 days to be implemented, which is also interesting because the bill is relatively sparse. I mean, the MRTA was like 200 pages or something like that. This bill's like 30.
Yeah, it's not that long.
Yeah, it's not that long. Most of the stuff is deferred to the regulations. I'm willing to bet, like I will literally bet my next paycheck, that there's no way the Department of Ag and Markets is going to get out the regulations for this entire bill in 90 days. I don't think that's going to happen. So we're going to be left in this kind of gray area where we don't really have regulations. We have a very vague statute. What does that all mean? So I think the most that hemp companies, CBD companies, things like that can take away from this is it's kind of the status quo insofar as we don't really know what's going on. And that's how it's been in the industry. We don't know what's going on at the federal level. We don't really know what's going on at the state level. It's all this kind of black box, and we're just kind of guessing and hoping that we're right and seeing what happens when we do things. And that's kind of where we are.
I know. I feel like since the Farm Bill came out at the end of 2018, I thought, okay, the Farm Bill is going to kind of eliminate, this gray area, which was this big. And now it seems like it hasn't really gotten any smaller, especially with the FDA kind of leaning one way or another and having these, behind closed doors meetings regarding CBD regulations. And then I said, okay, maybe New York State can kind of bring us a regulatory framework that will kind of eliminate this gray area. But now it's still here. So it's like, when we start to look at things from an industry perspective, and it's like, okay, well, we have these regulations, right? It's clear that things like CBD and extracts are approved and decriminalized and actually, encouraged for industry here in New York. But does this now still act as a barrier to things like merchant services and like traditional business resources and things that you would need to run a regular business? I don't know.
I mean, so that's actually a really good question, because while I think, for industrial hemp purposes, non-CBD, non-cannabinoid, but CBD specifically, for industrial hemp purposes, I don't think we have any, I will come out and say that it is my legal opinion that there's no issue doing industrial hemp. If you're licensed, then a bank's going to deal with you without a second thought. They're just going to deal with you just like an agricultural producer. You know, you're producing corn, whatever, although you don't need a license to produce corn. That's neither here nor there. But when we jump into that CBD realm, then the banks might get skittish again because there's that unknown at the federal level. It's not as, I mean, it's unknown. That's the thing, is it's not illegal like cannabis where they're going to be like, absolutely not, hands off until we get authorization. But they might be like, well, you know, if we loan you $1 million to start up your extraction company or something like that, what happens if the feds come in and seize all your products? You know, are we going to be able to get that $1 million back, even if you personally guaranteed it? Most people don't have $1 million. So does that mean that it's only reserved? The industry right now will be only reserved for the wealthiest individuals who can prove that they can pay back $1 million should the federal government seize their products? I don't really know. But I can certainly see the banking argument that maybe we're going to take a little hands-off approach on this right now because we just don't know. And we should be getting, well, hopefully we can get a little bit more information. I will be speaking on July 12th at the New York Bankers Association. I will be speaking on the agricultural panel about cannabis and hemp and all the issues to help start to educate the bankers. But I think that, you know, as much as we don't know, they know even less. So I think that and then banking is just a conservative industry in general. They're not exactly known for being risk takers. So I think that it is a totally valid question, and it's a concern is, you know, what's going to happen? We don't know.
Yeah, that having banking, at least state banking, you know, I'm assuming like the Bank of Americas and the big time, you know, banks will not be able to touch this until there's a federal at least descheduling. But state sanctioned banks, I mean, if there were a couple banks that were able to hop on this industry, at least at a small capacity, there's a lot of money to be made. Absolutely. You know, I've sat in, especially when I first started Tiva, I must have sat in front of 4 bankers, you know, M&T, BOA, CNB, all of them. And I went to them and literally said, okay, this is the law, right? This is the supply chain that makes this whole process legal. I'm perfectly compliant. And then the banker would say, wow, actually, this is pretty cool. I think this is something we could sink our teeth in. 24 hours later, I said, absolutely not. It's got the word cannabis in it. I'm just like, you know, what law is going to have to be written? Am I going to have to take Governor Cuomo with me to my next banking meeting and say, hey, ask him. It is legal.
Yeah, well, so, I mean, you kind of hit on a few things there because even if it's a local bank, they probably still use the federal wire system, which means that they're subject to federal funds and federal law, and maybe they're even federally chartered in addition to having a state charter, something like that. So they're just going to be nervous in general that the feds could revoke access, and that's a big problem for them. Not only that, but technically, if they're doing something illegal where they're taking money that isn't, so let's say that we're outside the industrial hemp realm and we're in the cannabinoid realm, the CBD, not THC, or CBD, and let's say that the FDA does come out, in fact, and in no uncertain terms says CBD, unless you're FDA approved, is illegal to sell. Let's just say that's the case. Then if a bank accepts that money from you who sold a bunch of CBD, that's technically money laundering and federal wire fraud. So that's a problem too. Like, they don't want to be involved in that at all. So again, it's just the unknowns and nothing, you know, they've just made it murkier. They haven't clarified anything.
I think that the only thing more outrageous than going to jail for like small possession charges of THC would be going to jail for selling bottles of, you know, organic certified CBD oil. I think there'd probably be an outrage, but
I would agree. I mean, I don't think it's likely. I mean, I can't even tell you if I don't think anybody's gone to jail for CBD. Well, I mean, like producing and selling. I think there was that like older lady in Texas or something that was like arrested at the airport. It's not kind of outside what we're talking about. So, but yeah.
Well, let's take a jump over to licensing. And I know there's been a little bit of licensing changes in this hemp bill, but you actually have firsthand experience in getting a hemp cultivation license, correct?
Yep.
Can you tell me a little bit about that process and kind of what you had to go through to make that happen?
So, yeah, I mean, right now it's like a 3-page application or something like that, but you do have, I mean, don't let the page length fool you. You do have to be very specific because it's under the pre-farm bill law. So it's under this pilot program where it's really research oriented. And so you have to disclose how you're going to be researching things. And it's not just, oh, we're going to be researching like growth mediums. Yeah, okay, everybody's doing that one. Like, we need more specifics than that. So it's really what specifically you're going to be researching. And in the cannabinoid realm, it's even more specific is, you know, how are you going to be researching this? And it's a big section that you have to disclose all this stuff. And then it's, what's the marketing like? Where are you procuring all the seeds? What kind of security are you implementing? All that type of stuff. Where are you going to be growing? Is it going to be indoor, outdoor, both? Who's involved in this whole process? But the interesting thing is that none of that really came about through statute or regulations. This is just on this app created by the Department of Ag and Markets. It doesn't really like... there's no statutory basis for like the specific things they're looking for or anything like that. So it's kind of like guessing as to what exactly they're looking for. Now, I've had a pretty good success rate. All my clients that have applied through me have gotten one. So, I mean, we've kind of cracked the code a little bit. Sure. But that'll probably change under this bill. You know, it's certainly doable, but the other interesting thing too is that's for the cultivation. The processing one is a little tougher because they haven't opened that one. They closed that one December 28th of 2018. They have not reopened it, except for Canopy Growth, who paid $150 million essentially to get one. Other than that,
Chump change.
Oh yeah, you know, pocket change. I carry that around with me all the time. Other than that one, I think there's somewhere around like 50-ish processors, but we don't know any of the sizes. I mean, somebody could get a processing license and not use it. That's totally a legitimate thing. I mean, if you're doing CO2 extraction, you know, at an industrial scale, you're spending $500,000 alone on one machine. Yeah, so, yeah. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if people are like, oh yeah, we're going to apply for these licenses, but now we need to go out and get the capital, blah, blah, blah. I don't know what the production capacity in New York is right now. So yeah, there's a lot of growers, fewer processors. I think we've grown several thousand acres of hemp over the last couple of years, but I mean, I don't have the numbers. I haven't seen the numbers of what our actual production capacity is in New York, how much we're processing. I mean, I've heard several processors saying they want to process 1,000 pounds a day. I don't even know if we have that much hemp.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah, especially if you're talking about multiple processors.
Yeah, I've worked with hemp processors that do 50,000 pounds a week out in Kentucky, which, you know, that's pretty standard. I've also worked with ones that can do no more than 60 pounds a day, you know, little mom and pop $5 million extraction facility. But like, yeah, I mean, you could have 100 different extraction facilities and licenses, but if they're only doing 60 to 100 pounds a day, you're not even scratching the surface. Granted, I guess I kind of don't know what's the ratio of hemp grown to the amount that's getting processed right now. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure, but what I do know is that there seems to be a lot more effort in the hemp side. And probably because resources more available, land's more available. There's farmers that have been doing this for a while. But really, the bottleneck and what's missing, short of a lab testing facility, which there's some around the country that are pretty accessible, is high quality processing. You know, a lot of people, the company I won't discuss, but a local company who's pretty involved in the nicotine industry was expressing their interest of building this industrial size ethanol extraction facility. And I'm thinking to myself, that's kind of a bad business decision. It's because it's like we're starting to look at all, do you need a different, I guess the better question is, do you need a license or a different license based on the type of processing that you're doing? Or like, what is it about processing? Is it just extraction? Is there an extraction specific license, or is it just processing in general?
Under the current or this hemp bill?
Let's talk about this hemp bill. Yeah.
So the hemp bill, they're going to have, so there's the industrial hemp license, which is non-cannabinoid. And then there's the cannabinoid licenses. So you have to be authorized to do industrial hemp. But if you want to do CBD or other cannabinoids on top of that, you need the cannabinoid growers license and or the manufacturing and or extraction. It's weird how they also define things in this bill, is because hemp extract is defined as the product of industrial hemp. Essentially, there's a little bit more to that, but that's basically what it boils down to. Then a cannabinoid grower's license is somebody who is authorized to cultivate hemp extract. I'm not really sure how you grow.
Just grow little bottles of CBD?
Yeah, apparently. They grow right out of the ground.
Wow.
So I don't know. It's a bizarre definition, but I mean, you can kind of infer what they were getting at is that if you want to grow hemp for the purpose of cannabinoids, you're going to need these licenses. And if you want to extract it, break it down to the cannabinoids and sell those cannabinoids, whether isolate, distillate, oils, whatever, you're going to need these additional licenses. And really the extraction and manufacturing, there's like one word that's different between the two. They're very, very similar. So essentially you're going to need probably 2 licenses unless you're purely extracting. If you're just a processor, then you can probably get away with the manufacturing and or extraction. But if you're growing and processing, you're going to need both. Arguably, even if you're just growing, there may be some, because of the way the things are defined, there may be even a need for the extraction license. I think what we can take away from this a lot is hastily drafted laws are bad. If you have a lawyer who's been practicing nearly a decade reading through this thing going, I'm not exactly sure what you mean, then that's probably an issue that needs to be resolved before it's like actually made law. Which is my 2 cents.
Well, and like, not throwing shade at Senator Metzger or Assemblywoman Lepardo, but neither of them are attorneys. I think it's Senator Metzger has a PhD in political science and Donna Lepardo has a master's in philosophy. And I'm sure while they're both intelligently bright women and they're not lawyers, I have a background and I have a bachelor's degree in neuroscience. Are you going to let me give you brain surgery? I don't think so. I know that's a little bit extreme, but at the same time, it's kind of the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the theoretical versus the practical. When a lawyer looks at something, we're looking at it through not only the law school academic eyes, but we're also looking at it from the practical of what does this mean and how can I break down this language to get where I want to go. And if you're not thinking like a lawyer while you're drafting these bills, then you're going to have an issue. I'm actually reminded of a story that I had from law school, and it was in one class. It was oddly an ethics class that we actually never discussed ethics, so it's weird at all. But we were asked to draft a piece of legislation. Very simply, it was just an exercise of prohibiting dogs off the leash in a park. Okay. Sounds pretty simple, right? So everybody goes, well, pretty much everybody. The first thing they write is like something along the lines of like, well, canines are prohibited, blah, 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 blah. Yeah. So, canines also includes wolves. Yeah. So we just prohibited wolves from being, so apparently we just allowed wolves to be on a leash in a park. No, you need Caninus familiaris, not Canis lupus. So you needed, but that's a simple thing. And this was a class full of law students. And they missed that kind of fact. So like, and that was like a glaring example. Sometimes we're just talking about like an and or an or the placement of a comma. I mean, that's how ridiculous lawyers are analyzing these things. And so when you're not thinking through every single aspect of that, that can provide a lot of unintended consequences down the road.
And even if you are an experienced attorney, there is going to be room for error because these bills are complex. But the crazy thing is that you don't have to be an attorney to be in the legislature, which is kind of, I understand because it allows it, everybody to get involved. But at the same time, you're working on very, very complicated laws and bills that involve some sort of legislative knowledge. And you have people coming here, maybe most of them are political science, maybe they're, culinary experts in college. I don't know. But to be able to be a free-for-all to people, and granted their staffers have legislative backgrounds or whatever, but at the end of the day, to be able to have a position as a senator or an assembly person and not necessarily need to have a background in law is, well, it's kind of scary.
Well, I mean, at the very least, it's a warning against doing things at the last minute and trying to push it through. Okay, if you're not a lawyer, fine, but give everybody a chance to read it. Give other lawyers a chance to read it and say, well, what about that issue? And how about that? And, here's a problem. And get some feedback to try to push something through. I mean, let's face it, Roc NORML, we were kind of, on the ball when it came to legislation involving any type of cannabis. Like, we kind of knew the landscape for a while. And this hemp bill caught us completely off guard because we didn't know it was coming until it was here. So if we didn't know that, then I'm going to say that most people didn't. And most people, including the legislature, didn't really know that this was happening. So it was kind of like literally last minute, pushed right through. What does that do? How is that going to come out in the end? I don't know. That's what I'm concerned about.
Yeah, I hope it's weird that we, like we said, we were so involved to the MRTA, and I would, I'm sure you can say the same, and Mary and everyone who was involved gets pretty much sit on a panel with you name it for your best, and we could have went toe to toe with anybody. And
Absolutely.
I'm not an attorney, I'm not an agricultural scientist, but we knew the law.
Absolutely.
And for this to sneak up on us like that, and really sneak up on everybody, it's wondering, how do you have a bill like the MRTA that's been in circulation for 5 years, and you can't get a fully Democratic House to support it, but yet you have this loosely written, kind of half-assed 11th hour bill, and all of a sudden everyone looks at it, everyone agrees, 62-0 yay. I'm pretty sure it was like almost unanimous yays to go through. And for me, I'm just like, how does that happen?
I'll bet some of it, well, clearly there was industry lobbying. That's usually a given. But I'm sure some of it, too, was the concern about regulating the entire cannabinoid market. I mean, we are in the Wild West. There's virtually no regulation. But the interesting thing is, if you read through the bill, is while they mandate cannabinoid grower manufacturing and extraction licenses, they have enabled the Department of Ag and Markets to issue permits. They haven't mandated permits for retailers, but they've said that the Department of Ag and Markets may issue permits for retailers to sell CBD products. So part of my thought is, well, did they push this through so that they could get some regulation out there? But then they're not regulating the retail end of it really at all. But they are regulating testing, labeling, things like that. So maybe that was kind of the push for it was, hey, we don't want this to be just kind of this gray market. Nobody really knows what they're getting. So we want to push this through. But why they didn't just do that in like its own little thing through regulations. Department of Ag and Markets can already regulate this stuff. They're allowed to. There's a statute that says this they can regulate. So why they didn't just push through a regulation is kind of odd to me, instead of this, bill that we're not quite sure what all of it means yet.
Yeah, I'm happy that, and this has been this hemp bill, I will say, as much as it has kind of its downfalls, it is a very consumer and farmer oriented bill. That, and one of the things we just talked about was it does have a mandate of lab testing and new label requirements, because I can't imagine you walk into any head shop out there or a store and grab a bottle of CBD if you're actually getting what you're purchasing. I would hope by this point that most companies are vetted and most, if a company, first thing that you should ask them when buying a bottle of CBD or any CBD product is show me your certificate of analysis and show me your third-party lab results. If they can't show that instantly, that's a huge red flag. So this will put that in place along with things on the label, because I was lucky enough when I first got started to work with this great company in Kentucky who obviously was the pioneers of, you know, the industrial hemp, kind of the industrial hemp industry. And they pretty much walked me through the language that I had to use on my labels, very similar to the supplement industry. Obviously, no medical claims. You had to be careful is like by the way that my product was manufactured compared to how other products was manufactured, because it was manufactured in an FDA food grade facility. At the time, it was considered a food product, not a supplement. So on a food product, you have to have things like calories and nutrients, but you don't have to put like CBD. You just have to put full spectrum hemp extract, right? So while it, you know, based on where it's processed or where it's bottled will depend on what the language on the label is. So I'm glad to see that will happen here. That'll be a big benefit for consumers. Another thing that I was reading, and this is in section S537, and that says licensed cannabinoid growers shall be prohibited from using pesticides. My question is that the same for like the beer industry?
No. So what I have heard the reasoning for that is because there are no federal guidelines right now on like cannabis pesticides and stuff, because it's illegal at the federal level. So they don't have these federal guidelines. So they're just outright saying no pesticides.
Because there's, I think, like an FDA approved list of like banned or usable pesticides. But you're right. If it is illegal, you essentially have to get rid of all of them, or that's, I think, the only option, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a little, I mean, I don't know what that means for farmers either. Try growing a crop without pesticides. I can't imagine that's going to go very well.
You're going to need an army of scarecrows.
Yeah. And the bugs and everything like that. I mean, like, I don't know what that means. I mean, are there actual crops and viable commercial farms that are grown without pesticides? I have to imagine that's going to decimate a crop.
Well, I would assume, like, kind of just like the drug industry, there's probably different tiers of pesticides where it's like, okay, if it meets these parameters, maybe it's like a stage 3 pesticide where, you know, maybe the positives outweigh the negatives. But, you know, I'm assuming that, you know, it would be almost, to me, seemingly impossible to have a fully pesticide-free market.
I would think so.
Crop, right?
I honestly don't know. I mean, unless you're willing to sacrifice some percentage of your crop to pests. I mean, pesticides, I'm not advocating like that everybody should be using, we should be ingesting tons of poisons and everything, but like, I kind of feel like you need to use some, even if they're, you know, more organic, which is also a misleading term, because organic just means that it's organic compounds. Doesn't mean that you can like guzzle it and it's not going to kill you. You know, organophosphate, it's an organic compound.
And I think if there's any farmers listening to this, and obviously it's not live, but I'd be curious, send us a message on the Roc NORML Facebook page or YouTube and see if you can clarify that, because that's not something that I have an answer to. I don't know if there's farms that are entirely pesticide free. I mean, that would be great, but the practicality of it seems unlikely. But I think, I don't know. I'm going to come back to that on next episode. But what I do want to talk about is another portion of this S537 aspect of this bill, and that has to do with extract-infused beverages. Because according to federal law, it is illegal to infuse food and beverage with CBD, right? And we can remember early on in this year, I think it was through February and April, there was these random kind of Gestapo CBD raids on these mom-and-pop bakery shops where they were literally confiscating like CBD brownies and cookies and all this fun stuff, right? It's kind of crazy, but the law says that you can't infuse food products with CBD, correct?
Well, so let's step back and just understand what's going on there. Is so the FDA in their letter right after the Farm Bill passed said that CBD is an active ingredient in an FDA regulated pharmaceutical, Epidiolex. It's for 2 rare childhood seizure disorders. Therefore, under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, you cannot put an active ingredient in an FDA-approved pharmaceutical into another product without FDA approval. So I can't start sticking aspirin into cupcakes and calling them, pain reliever cupcakes and selling them on the market unless the FDA gives me the thumbs up.
Yeah.
So that's why you can now the FDA said in their opinion, but they have not issued regulations on this. This was just like literally in like a 2-page letter from the I believe now former chair
Scott Gottlieb. Yeah.
Yeah. So does it carry any weight? Couldn't really tell you. So there's at least the argument to say that it is illegal. I don't know that it is actually illegal, but I mean, if you were going to be erring on the side of caution and be ultra conservative, then yes, no CBD in human consumables, or animal, actually.
Really?
Yes.
Animal too.
Because animals are covered under the FD&C Act as well.
I did not know that.
Yep.
Well, this makes this piece of language that I pulled from the bill very interesting. And it says, within 30 days of the effective date of this article, the department shall approve the manufacture, distribution, and sale of beverages containing no more than 20 milligrams of cannabidiol per 12-ounce beverage. The hemp extract used in such beverages shall be grown, extracted, and manufactured in the state of New York. The department shall issue guidance on the label, warning, point of sale, and advertising for such beverages. There's two things part of that paragraph that are questionable. A, it's the sourcing from New York State, but B, it's writing language that allows it to be infused into beverages. How does that all work?
Well, and here's my other question. Why only beverages? I mean, if we're going to go with the whole, it's the FDA said beverages and, food, no good. Why are we only considering beverages then? Like, I don't get why that happened at all. Now, we can go back to, if I'm trying to rationalize this, if I'm representing the government in a lawsuit where somebody's claiming this is unconstitutional, my rationale again is saying, well, the federal government said it's illegal. We're allowing this to happen within New York. So therefore the federal government must take a hands-off approach. Except, notice there's no limitation that you can only sell those things within New York. I don't see that in the bill anywhere. So there's nothing stopping, so far as I can tell, a New York company, let's say they are complying with the bill, using New York source hemp extract, and then selling that out of state. That's interstate commerce. So I don't really understand the point of that provision at all, other than being very protectionist and I would think per se unconstitutional. I think we've established the theme for today is we don't really know.
Well, that's I guess I don't even know if this is an argument. Obviously, I'm not an attorney, but because we know that there's, this federal illegality of having CBD mixed with beverages and food, but then you offer it at a state level. Granted, there's no federal state protection. It hasn't really, we're not seeing the feds come and interfere. Obviously, we can talk about the Cole memo. Now we can talk about the introduction of the States Act, which if the States Act, I believe, was enacted, that would make this a different story. But how do we, a company like Constellation Brands, which we know is, getting into the CBD infused beverage market, who was already, involved in canopy growth, just, discussing, having this $150 million processing facility and getting into the beverage market. How does this affect somebody of that capacity, which I'm sure had a little bit of corporate lobbying behind it?
Well, I'm willing to bet, and actually might have hit something on the head there. I'm willing to bet that in the very specific example of Constellation Brands in relation to canopy growth, probably actually supports that because, Constellation owns it's like a third of Canopy or something like that. Canopy now having one of the, or on the verge of building probably the largest processing facility in New York. Yeah, I mean, if I'm Constellation Brands, I'm saying definitely that's awesome because guess who's going to be supplying New York hemp extract? It's not going to be mom and pop. It's going to be my $150 million facility that's cranking out 50,000 pounds a day or processing 50,000 pounds a day. For them, I might be, celebrating because my stock price is going to go up or something like that. But for, the retailers, like let's just think about an example where New York land, like, in the middle of the state, southern tier, would be cheap as compared to land in Monroe County or certainly like New York City.
Sure.
But is that land cheap as compared to Kansas, Nebraska? I'm going to guess no. I haven't actually looked, but I'm willing to bet the land in New York is a little, if not more valuable, there's at least more taxes associated with it. Sure. So what does that mean for retailers and processors who want to sell in New York if they're forced to use New York hemp product that's more expensive than everything else on the market? What does that mean? You know, did that just drive the cost up? Does that actually hurt New York in the federal market? Because now New York producers who are growing and processing and selling in New York, or growing and processing and then selling outside of New York, does that hurt their market because they can't offer something as cheaply as it is grown and processed in Kentucky? I mean, I think there's an argument that, yeah, that does hurt those people.
Well, I mean, we think about Constellation Brands and their business model. They really are like a hub, right? And they build these, farmer to, seed to sale supply chain for things like alcohol, right? So are they essentially creating the processing hub and going to help, boost the local, small town hemp economy in New York State by saying, hey, we're going to bring all the hemp and we're going to process it into our processing facility, and then we're going to start infusing into beverages. All of a sudden I can start to see, well, yeah, okay, a New York-based supply chain for beverages does make sense. But there's only going to be one, maybe two players in this game. And if there's anybody that wants to play in the CBD market, you're going to have a hard time competing with Constellation Brands. They're a very, very big entity with virtually limitless cash. So yeah, this I think the theme of today is we don't really know, and that just because these bills are put, or these laws are written, doesn't actually mean they're right, and definitely doesn't mean that they're well written. It takes people like Jason to scrutinize them and bring a true expertise to it, and for that we thank you. Is there anything else you want to chat before we wrapped up today?
No, I think I think it's just important for all the listeners to realize that though the MRTA died this session, that doesn't mean it's dead. We are at Roc NORML are still picking it up. We are still going to be talking to legislators. We are going to be getting more information on this hemp bill. We are continuing, and we fully intend to make sure that this is picked up, as early as December, because there was some language that they potentially could vote on this in December, but certainly next legislative session. So I think it's just important for all the listeners to realize that, don't get discouraged. This is still this is not dead. We are still fighting for everything. We are still, making sure that New York has a role to play here.
Yeah, and it's pretty clear. I mean, Cuomo has said in multiple accounts that this is, the correct way to do it is full legalization. Carl Heastie said, in regards to this bill and the decrim bill, this is a road to legalization. So we know that we have the leaders on board. And I think, knowing that there were the Long Island senators who played a, significant role in the blockade of this, I think with the leadership having this, agenda of, okay, we're going to get this passed, and some of the statewide scrutiny on this, the Democrats that failed to get this passed, I would venture to say that there's a very high likelihood of this getting passed in the next legislative session. It would be interesting if it didn't get voted through this legislative session, because it is an election year. And generally, I believe it's harder for controversial topics to get through the legislature in, amidst an election season. But I don't think this is much of a controversial topic anymore. This seems to be the topic in New York. It's getting local, state, and national attention. And I think we see a very high possibility that it gets pushed through in December. So we'll have to see.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add to that is that while I agree that the controversial topics in a election year are difficult, they still can hide behind the budget bill. So it can just be an up or down vote. And, even because the rationale previously of why they thought that it could go in the budget was that anybody who thought it was, the Long Island Democrats, they could have hid behind, well, yeah, we voted in favor of the bill, the budget, and yes, it contained this cannabis thing, but overall the budget was good. So we still do provide that legislative cover for the budget bills. So I think that's an additional reason to think that this could definitely happen next year, is that there is still that cover.
Yeah, and to close, it's like, God forbid it doesn't go through with the legislature and it gets reintroduced in the form of in the budget. What does that bill look like? Does it look like the CRTA? Are we going to get to a point where it's like, oh man, if we don't vote on this, it's going to be another year? And it's like, I know that we have a very specific list of non-negotiables, and I hope that next time around, whether it goes to the legislature or that it goes to the governor, that it will encompass at least the majority. But as we know with New York State politics, nothing is certain until the 11th hour. So with that, thank you so much for coming on here again and decoding this relatively complex and ill-written bill. And stay tuned. We have a lot of really good events coming up in the next 2 months. We'll be sending out newsletters. Actually, one just went out at 4 p.m. Again, thanks for listening. We are out.